What if the man who once threw you away became the one thing standing in the way of your destiny? 5 years ago, Clara Bennett was nothing more than a secretary fired, humiliated, and left alone while carrying twins. Her powerful boss, Richard Hale, offered her a severance check and a demand disappear. But instead of vanishing, Clara turned her pain into purpose. She clawed her way through eviction notices, hospital nights, and endless rejection until she built an empire from scratch. Now, Clara has returned not as the discarded assistant Richard once knew, but as the billionaire CEO of a company worth more than his. And she isn't just here for business. She's here with two little girls who share his unmistakable blue eyes. How will Richard react when the truth he buried comes crashing into his boardroom? Can Clara balance vengeance with compassion, power with motherhood, and in the end, who truly defines a person's worth, the world, or themselves? This is a story of betrayal and resilience, of heartbreak transformed into triumph. If you believe every voice deserves to be heard, and every struggle can become strength, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the 32nd floor of Hale Logistics' Manhattan headquarters. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, voices carried sharp tones of urgency. It was a Wednesday morning like any other, but for Clara Bennett, seated at her glass-topped desk outside the CEO's office, the air felt unusually heavy. Clara had always been the quiet kind, the type who moved with calm efficiency, blending into the background while keeping the machinery of the company running smoothly. She organized Richard Hale's life down to the minute, scheduled his board meetings, booked his flights, even sent flowers to his estranged wife when public appearances demanded it. She wasn't flashy. Her wardrobe was neat but modest navy skirts, crisp blouses, low heels. She kept her hair pinned in a bun that revealed the soft planes of her face. And yet, beneath that composed exterior, Clara carried a secret. The secret had begun 5 weeks earlier, the night Richard called her into his office after hours to review a presentation. The city glowed beneath them as rain streaked the windows. He had poured scotch into 2 crystal glasses. He spoke about pressure, about loneliness, about how no one understood the weight of leading an empire. Clara, against her better judgment, listened with sympathy. One mistake, one night, had changed everything. Now, as she sat at her desk, Clara pressed a trembling hand against her abdomen. The doctor's words echoed in her mind. "You're 8 weeks along." A knock at her desk broke the spiral. Richard's voice, sharp and commanding, called from inside his office. "Clara, come in." She rose, smoothed her skirt, and entered. The office was cavernous, with panoramic views of the East River. Richard Hale, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, stood by the window. His reflection in the glass looked more like a portrait of power than a man. "You wanted to see me?" Clara asked softly. Richard turned, his expression unreadable. He gestured to the sleek leather chair opposite his desk. "Sit." She obeyed, heart pounding. "I've heard some troubling news," he began. "It seems you've been visiting doctors during work hours. Is there something I should know?" Clara inhaled. The truth sat heavy on her tongue. She forced the words out before courage could slip away. "I'm pregnant, Richard." Silence. The word hung in the air like a thundercloud. His jaw tightened. "Is it mine?" Clara flinched. "You know it is." For a fleeting moment, a flicker of something fear maybe crossed his face, but it vanished beneath cold detachment. He reached into a drawer and slid a white envelope across the desk. "There's a check inside, $50,000. More than enough to take care of this situation." Quietly. Clara's breath caught. The humiliation scorched her cheeks. She pushed the envelope back. "I don't want your money. I want respect. I want acknowledgement." Richard's tone hardened. "Clara, think carefully. You're a secretary. Do you really believe anyone will side with you against me? This will ruin your career, your reputation. Take the money and make the smart choice." Her throat ached, but she kept her voice steady. The smart choice is keeping this child, my child. You may not want to be a father, Richard, but I will not erase a life because it's inconvenient for you. The air grew icy. Richard leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Then you leave me no choice. Your services are no longer required here. Security will escort you out. The words struck like a hammer. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her. 5 years of loyalty, late nights, sacrifices all dismissed in a single breath. She rose slowly, forcing dignity into her posture. One day, she said quietly, you'll regret this. Richard said nothing. He had already turned back to the window, his silhouette framed against the city skyline, as though she no longer existed. Minutes later, Clara found herself carrying a cardboard box of belongings through the marble lobby of Hale Logistics. The stares of colleagues burned her skin. The revolving doors whooshed open, releasing her into the sharp autumn wind. On the sidewalk, tears blurred the world. She pressed a hand protectively over her belly. The baby, no babies. Though she didn't know that, it shifted inside her. She whispered to the life within, you are wanted, no matter what he says. You are mine, and I will fight for you. As she stood alone on that crowded Manhattan street, the enormity of her future pressed in. No job, no partner, no safety net, only a child growing inside her, and the faint ember of determination flickering in her chest. Clara lifted her chin against the wind. She didn't yet know how she would survive, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would never let Richard Hale define her worth again. The taxi ride from Midtown to Queens felt like a descent into another world. Only an hour earlier, Clara Bennett had walked out of the glittering Hale Logistics Tower with her belongings in a cardboard box. Now, the bright lights of Manhattan receded behind her, replaced by dim street lamps, laundromats with flickering signs, and corner bodegas stacked with dusty produce. The cab stopped in front of a squat brick building with peeling paint. Clara paid the driver with shaking hands and dragged her box up 3 flights of narrow stairs. Apartment 3B smelled faintly of mildew, but it was hers. Barely. The space was small, a kitchen the size of a closet, a living room that doubled as a bedroom, 1 bathroom with a dripping faucet. She set her box on the counter and sat on the sagging couch. The silence pressed in, broken only by the buzz of an old refrigerator. She was alone. Her parents lived upstate, but she hadn't spoken to them in nearly 2 years. They had never approved of her moving to New York, of chasing big city ambitions. Her mother's last words still stung. Don't come crawling back when it all falls apart. Clara knew better than to expect comfort now. Friends? Most had drifted away when she became consumed with work at Hale Logistics. Late nights and constant travel had left little room for social life. The few she still texted were acquaintances, not the kind you called in crisis. She pressed her palms to her abdomen. The life inside her was the only company she had. That night, Clara pulled out a notebook she kept tucked in her purse. She hadn't written in it since college, but the urge to record her thoughts overwhelmed her. She opened to a blank page and let the pen move. October 12th, everything collapsed today. Fired, humiliated, alone. He offered me money to erase this baby, as if a life could be reduced to a line item on his balance sheet. I refused. I don't know how I'll pay rent or buy groceries, but I couldn't take his check. I couldn't let him decide the value of my child, or me. Her hand trembled as she wrote, but she felt lighter after filling the page. The act of writing gave form to the chaos swirling inside her. Over the next days, survival became routine. She pawned her wristwatch to cover rent. She applied for part-time jobs at diners and retail stores, careful not to mention her pregnancy. She learned to stretch a bag of rice and a carton of eggs into meals for a week. At night, she wrote again. Sometimes letters to the baby, sometimes angry rants at Richard, sometimes prayers she wasn't sure anyone heard. October 21st. Dear little one, you don't know me yet, but I promise you this. You are wanted. You will never feel like an inconvenience. I don't care how hard it gets. I'll find a way. We'll make it together. There were moments when fear consumed her. What if she got sick? What if she lost the apartment? What if Richard made good on his threat and destroyed her reputation so no one would hire her? But with each wave of panic came a flicker of resolve. She had already chosen. She had said no to the money, no to erasing the life inside her. That single decision, terrifying as it was, became her anchor. Weeks slipped by. The weather cooled. Leaves scattered across cracked sidewalks. Clara bundled herself in an old coat and rode the subway to job interviews. Some days she returned empty-handed. Other days she managed a few hours of work bussing tables or entering data for a temp agency. Every paycheck, no matter how small, felt like defiance. She marked the calendar with the weeks of her pregnancy. Each square filled with a number gave her a strange sense of triumph. 8 weeks, 9, 10. The baby was growing. She was still standing. One evening, while stirring a pot of thin soup, Clara's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Richard, last chance. Take the money. Start over. No one has to know. Her hands shook as she read it. Anger rose like fire in her chest. She set the phone down on the counter, opened her notebook, and wrote furiously. November 3rd. He thinks my life is something to be bought off. He thinks this baby is disposable. But every time he tries to erase us, I grow stronger. He will not define me. I will not be erased. When she finally returned to the phone, she deleted the message without replying. That night, lying on her thin mattress, Clara placed a hand on her stomach and whispered, "We're going to prove him wrong." The city outside groaned with sirens and car horns, but inside that small apartment, a quiet strength began to take root. Clara didn't feel powerful yet. She didn't feel brave every hour of the day. But somewhere in the marrow of her bones, determination was forming. She would not bend. She would not vanish. Not for Richard Hale. Not for anyone. The snow was falling in heavy sheets the night Clara went into labor. She was barely 34 weeks along, far too soon, and the sharp cramps tore through her body like a warning bell she couldn't ignore. By the time she reached Elmhurst Hospital in Queens, her breaths came in ragged bursts, her coat soaked through from melting snow. The emergency room nurses whisked her into a wheelchair, their practiced urgency only feeding her fear. She caught fragments of their words: premature, twins, possible complications, but they blurred together in a haze of pain. Hours stretched into an eternity. Bright lights, monitors beeping. The metallic scent of antiseptic. Clara clung to the edge of consciousness, her body racked with effort. Somewhere in the chaos, a doctor urged her to push, and with a final cry that tore her throat raw, the first tiny wail filled the room. A girl. Before Clara could process it, another wave surged through her, demanding more strength she didn't think she had. Minutes later, a second cry pierced the air higher, thinner, more fragile. Another girl. The nurses moved quickly, too quickly. Clara caught only fleeting glimpses. 2 impossibly small bodies, wrinkled and red, whisked away to incubators. She tried to reach out, to hold them, but her arms felt like lead. "Please," she whispered, "let me see them." "You will," a nurse promised gently. "But first, we need to stabilize them." Clara lay back against the pillow, tears sliding into her hair. She had imagined this moment countless times, soft blankets, the sweet weight of a newborn against her chest, whispered lullabies. Instead, she was left with empty arms and the cold echo of her daughter's cries. When she finally entered the neonatal intensive care unit hours later, she froze at the sight. The room hummed with machines. Rows of incubators glowed under fluorescent light. Nurses moved with quiet precision, adjusting tubes and checking monitors. And there, side by side, lay her daughters. Each was no bigger than a doll, swaddled in tiny blankets, with wires taped to their fragile skin. Their chests rose and fell with labored rhythm, aided by the soft hiss of oxygen. One had a faint tuft of pale blonde hair, The other, a darker shade, but both bore the same delicate features that mirrored Clara's own. Clara pressed her hand to the glass of the incubator, her throat tight. They were so impossibly small, yet so fiercely alive. A nurse touched her shoulder. They're fighters. Premature, yes, but strong. They'll need time here, maybe weeks. You can sit with them as long as you want. Clara sank into the chair between the incubators. Hours passed unnoticed as she whispered to them, told them stories of the world waiting outside, promised them she would be there every step of the way. She named them quietly, names she had carried in her heart for months but never spoken aloud: Lillian Grace and Charlotte Rose. Lillian for her grandmother, who had taught her resilience. Charlotte for the sister she never had. Grace and Rose, middle names that spoke of hope and beauty in the face of hardship. The days blurred into a rhythm of hospital visits, whispered prayers, and mounting bills. Clara's modest savings evaporated within weeks. Every beep of a monitor seemed to echo in her chest. Every doctor's frown deepened the pit in her stomach. She began carrying her notebook to the NICU, filling pages while her daughters slept under the blue glow of phototherapy lights. December 14th. Today, they said, Lillian's weight dropped again. I feel like I can't breathe until I see the numbers go up. I keep thinking, what if I fail them? What if I can't hold everything together? But then Charlotte squeezes my finger with her tiny hand, and I remember they're fighting too. We're all fighting. Some nights Clara didn't go home at all. She slept in a stiff plastic chair, wrapped in her coat, jolting awake at every nurse's movement. She learned the language of the NICU bilirubin, CPAP, feeding tubes. She learned how to scrub her hands raw before touching her children, how to slip her fingers gently under their minuscule palms. The exhaustion was bone deep. Some mornings, she wept silently in the hospital bathroom, her reflection pale and hollow-eyed. But each time, she dried her face, squared her shoulders, and returned to the incubators, because leaving wasn't an option. One evening, as snow flurries dusted the city outside, Clara sat between her daughters, humming softly. A nurse paused nearby, listening. "You've got a beautiful voice," the nurse said. Clara smiled faintly. "I don't know about that. I just want them to hear me, to know they're not alone. That matters more than you think," the nurse replied. Clara looked back at the incubators, her heart swelling with a mix of awe and terror. These two tiny beings had made her both weaker and stronger than she had ever known. Weak, because the thought of losing them was unbearable. Strong, because she would fight the world itself to protect them. She pressed her hand to the glass again, whispering so softly only they could hear, "You were never a mistake. You are my miracle. I'll never let you feel unwanted, not for 1 second." The promise settled into her bones, unshakable. Weeks later, on a bitter January morning, the doctors finally cleared the girls to leave the hospital. They were still small, still fragile, but strong enough to face the world beyond the NICU walls. Clara bundled them in donated blankets and tucked them into the second-hand car seats a nurse had helped her find. As she stepped out into the cold air, both daughters nestled against her. Clara felt the weight of responsibility pressed down, and yet, for the first time since that terrible day in Richard's office, she also felt something else. Hope. The days after Lillian and Charlotte came home from the hospital blurred into an exhausting cycle of feeding, rocking, and praying. The little apartment in Queens felt even smaller now, cluttered with donated blankets, bottles, and secondhand cribs squeezed into the living room. Money was disappearing faster than Clara could count. The NICU bills had left her drowning, and formula alone cost more than she earned in a week. She had no choice but to work. Mornings began at the corner diner, where she tied her hair back under a faded visor and took orders from construction workers and office clerks. The air always smelled of bacon grease and burnt coffee, and Clara learned to move quickly, balancing 3 plates on one arm, refilling mugs before customers snapped their fingers. By the end of each shift, her feet ached, and her hands were raw from scrubbing counters. She tucked her tips into an envelope hidden beneath her mattress, praying it would stretch far enough to cover rent. Evenings belonged to the girls. She rocked them through their cries, spooned medicine into their mouths when fevers spiked, and sang them lullabies she half remembered from childhood. Sometimes she forgot to eat herself. But when the clock struck midnight, her day wasn't over. Clara would settle the twins into their cribs and open her old laptop on the kitchen table. She logged into a data entry portal, typing insurance claim numbers until her eyes blurred. The pay was meager, but every cent mattered. At 3 a.m, when exhaustion made her fingers slip across the keyboard, Charlotte's cry would pierce the silence. Clara dragged herself to the crib, scooping the baby up and pacing the apartment floor. She whispered into the darkness, "Mama's here. Always here." The only reason she could manage it all was Mrs. Caldwell. Her neighbor across the hall was an elderly widow with silver hair always tucked under a neat scarf. She had been the first to knock on Clara's door after hearing the baby's cry, carrying a plate of homemade cookies, and the kind of steady presence that instantly softened Clara's frayed nerves. "I lost my husband 20 years ago," Mrs. Caldwell had said matter-of-factly, "and I never had children of my own. But I know how to soothe a fussy baby, and I'm not afraid of diapers." From then on, Mrs. Caldwell became both babysitter and anchor. When Clara rushed to her diner shifts, Mrs. Caldwell rocked the twins in her recliner, humming hymns in a gentle, quivering voice. She refused payment beyond the occasional grocery bag or shared meal. "You're doing something sacred, Clara," she would remind her. "Raising these girls alone, it takes a strength most people will never understand. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Those words carried Clara through many nights when despair threatened to break her. Still, the weight of survival pressed heavy. One frigid January morning, she spilled hot coffee across her uniform while rushing between tables. The burns stung, but what hurt more was the customer's irritated mutter, "Clumsy girl can't even do her job." She ducked into the restroom, dabbing at her blouse with paper towels, tears pricking her eyes. For a moment, she saw herself the way Richard must have seen her, insignificant, disposable. But then she thought of Lillian's tiny hand curling around her finger, of Charlotte's soft sighs as she drifted to sleep. They needed her steady, not broken. She straightened her shoulders, cleaned herself up, and returned to the floor with a polite smile. That night, after a 12-hour day, she collapsed onto her mattress while both girls wailed in unison. She wanted to cry with them, to scream into the darkness that it was all too much. But instead, she rocked one baby against her chest while gently bouncing the other's crib with her foot. She whispered to them through her tears, "We're going to make it. I don't know how. But we will." Small flickers of hope kept her going. The diner manager began giving her extra shifts, impressed by her reliability. A customer left a $20 tip with a note that read, "For your kindness, keep going." One evening, Mrs. Caldwell surprised her with a tiny framed picture of Clara and the twins, taken with a disposable camera. "Every mother needs a reminder of why she fights," the older woman said softly. Clara placed the photo on the kitchen counter, where she could see it each night as she typed endless numbers into her laptop. The sight of her daughter's fragile smiles made the fatigue bearable, yet despair was never far. On a rainy Tuesday, Clara's subway stalled for nearly an hour. By the time she arrived at the diner, she was late, drenched, and trembling with panic. The manager frowned but said nothing. Clara worked her shift with wet hair plastered to her cheeks, her shoes squeaking with each step. That night, back in her apartment, she opened her notebook and wrote, "February 6th, I'm drowning. No matter how many hours I work, the bills pile higher. Sometimes I think about calling him, asking for help. But then I remember his envelope, his words. Erase this situation? No. I won't go back to that. I can't." She slammed the notebook shut and kissed her sleeping daughters. Their soft breath steadied her resolve. Life in those years was not glamorous. It was spilled coffee, secondhand clothes, subway delays, and exhaustion so deep it felt like walking through fog. But it was also baby giggles, the warmth of a neighbor's kindness, and the quiet knowledge that Clara was still standing. Hope flickered like a stubborn flame, refusing to die out. And though Clara didn't know it yet, the struggles in the shadows were shaping her into something far stronger than Richard Hale or anyone else could ever have imagined. The routine at the diner never changed. Orders shouted over the hiss of the grill, coffee pots clanging back onto warmers, customers tapping their watches when food took too long. To most, it was chaos. To Clara, it became a puzzle. She noticed how delivery drivers often showed up late, wandering in with excuses about traffic or missed turns. Orders went missing, customers stormed out, and tips shrank. The manager grumbled, but nothing changed. One morning, Clara carried a tray of pancakes to a family when she overheard a driver mutter, 3 stops in Brooklyn, then 2 in Queens, all out of order. They don't even route these deliveries right. Something in Clara's mind clicked. She knew nothing about programming, but she knew inefficiency when she saw it. If deliveries were better organized, fewer mistakes would happen. Customers would be happier, drivers would earn more tips, the diner would make more money. That night, after putting the twins to bed, Clara sat at her kitchen table with her old notebook. Instead of diary entries, she drew boxes and arrows, orders, routes, estimated times. She didn't know the technical words, but she could see the patterns in her head. She scribbled late into the night. What if software could predict the fastest path? What if drivers had a tool instead of scribbled notes? By dawn, the pages were filled with rough sketches, half maps, half daydreams. The idea wouldn't leave her alone. Weeks later, after a grueling double shift, Clara tucked her tips into the envelope under her mattress. Then she paused. For the first time, she didn't count the bills for rent or formula. She counted them for something else. At a pawn shop on Roosevelt Avenue, she found a battered laptop with keys worn smooth. The shop owner shrugged. It works. Mostly. It cost $140, nearly half her envelope. Clara hesitated, thinking of groceries, of diapers. But then she remembered the driver's complaints, the customers slamming doors, the endless waste she saw each day. She handed over the cash, walking home with the laptop under her arm. She felt a strange flicker in her chest. Not hope, exactly. Possibility. The first nights with the laptop were clumsy. Clara searched online for how to build software, stumbling into forums she barely understood. She wrote down every unfamiliar word: algorithm, API, database. The terms looked like another language, but she refused to be intimidated. She found free coding tutorials, listening through cheap earbuds while rocking a baby with one arm. Some nights, she typed lines of practice code with one hand, while Lillian slept curled against her shoulder. Other times, Charlotte's cries interrupted her mid-lesson, forcing her to reread the same paragraph 10 times. Her notes filled with trial and error, forget semicolon, program breaks, array, OOP list, don't panic, just keep trying. The progress was slow, but each tiny success felt monumental. When she finally made a simple program display, hello, world on the screen, tears blurred her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Mrs. Caldwell noticed the change. You're up later than ever these days, the older woman remarked one evening, peering into Clara's apartment as she returned a casserole dish. Clara smiled tiredly. I'm learning something new. Trying. Anyway. Mrs. Caldwell studied her with gentle curiosity. Whatever it is, I can see it puts light back in your eyes. Don't let go of that, dear. At the diner, Clara became more observant. She asked drivers questions, pretending it was casual conversation. How long does it usually take you to get through a run? What's the hardest part about keeping orders straight? What do you wish you had to make the job easier? Most laughed off her curiosity, but she wrote down every answer, piece by piece. The puzzle sharpened. She began designing her first simple project, a program that could sort addresses into the most efficient route. It was crude, barely functional, but when she tested it with sample addresses, it saved 10 minutes compared to random order. 10 minutes might not mean much to most, but to a driver working for tips, it meant everything. Still, doubt gnawed at her. One night, after both girls finally fell asleep, Clara sat staring at the glowing screen. The lines of code blurred. Her mind whispered, "Who are you kidding? You're a waitress with 2 kids. You don't belong in this world of tech geniuses." She closed the laptop, pressing her hands over her face. The exhaustion, the bills, the weight of single motherhood, all of it threatened to drown her. But then Charlotte stirred in her crib, letting out a tiny whimper. Clara lifted her gently, feeling the warmth of her daughter's body against her chest. Looking at her daughter's sleeping faces, Clara whispered, "If I don't try, what future do I give you? A mother who gave up? No. That's not who we are." She reopened the laptop. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat, waiting for her to continue. Clara's progress was uneven. Some nights she made breakthroughs, watching her program grow piece by piece. Other nights, she felt crushed by frustration, tempted to throw the laptop against the wall, but slowly, the impossible began to feel within reach. She wasn't just learning code, she was reshaping her identity. No longer only the fired secretary or the exhausted waitress. She was building something that mattered. Each keystroke carried defiance. Every bug she solved pushed back against Richard's voice in her memory, telling her she'd never belong. One night, after debugging for hours, Clara leaned back in her chair as her program finally ran without errors. The screen displayed a neat list of addresses in optimized order. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Her daughters slept peacefully in the background, their soft breaths filling the room. Clara pressed her hand over her heart, a quiet vow forming on her lips. This is just the beginning. By the time Lillian and Charlotte turned 2, Clara's notebooks were filled with sketches, flowcharts, and crude algorithms. Her little apartment in Queens looked more like a study lab than a home, with papers stacked beside cribs and half-finished coding tutorials playing softly on the laptop. She knew she had something, but she also knew she couldn't build it alone. One evening, while waiting for the twins at a free story hour at the public library, Clara noticed a flyer pinned to the bulletin board, Brooklyn Small Business Incubator, applications open for women entrepreneurs. Her first instinct was doubt. She wasn't an entrepreneur. She was a waitress who dabbled in code after midnight. But then she imagined her daughters 5 years from now, asking what she had done with her ideas. That thought was enough to push her forward. The incubator was held in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, its exposed brick walls plastered with motivational posters about innovation and disruption. Rows of tables held hopeful founders pitching apps, gadgets, and services. Clara walked in wearing her one professional blouse and a skirt she had ironed 3 times to hide its age. She clutched her laptop like a lifeline, her hands trembling. When it was her turn, she stood before a panel of investors and mentors. Her voice shook at first, but she pressed on. "I've built a prototype for logistics optimization," she explained. "It helps delivery drivers find the most efficient routes, reducing delays and saving money." The panel exchanged glances. One man smirked. "So? It's like Google Maps." But worse, another leaned back, arms crossed. "Do you even have a background in computer science?" Clara swallowed hard. "No. I've taught myself while raising twin daughters. But the inefficiencies I've seen firsthand show me there's a gap. Something existing tools aren't solving for small businesses." A woman on the panel raised an eyebrow. "And you think you can compete with billion-dollar tech companies as a single mom?" The words cut like a blade. Clara forced herself to hold steady, though humiliation burned her cheeks. "I'm not asking you to bet on my resume. I'm asking you to bet on the results. My prototype works." But the panel wasn't interested. They dismissed her with polite nods, moving to the next eager founder. Weeks followed with more of the same. investor meetings where men in suits chuckled at her homemade slides, networking events where people brushed past her to talk to younger, flashier founders. Each rejection chipped away at her confidence, but Clara kept returning, notebook in hand, refining her pitch after every failure. At home, she tried to hide her discouragement from Lillian and Charlotte, now toddlers who climbed onto her lap, demanding attention. She smiled for them, even as she wrote in her notebook late at night. March 6th, they see me as nothing, just a mother with a silly dream. But they don't see the nights I've spent coding with a baby on my hip. They don't see the hunger that won't let me quit. One day, someone appeared in the form of Evelyn Cross. Evelyn was a woman in her mid-60s with sharp gray eyes and an elegance that spoke of old money and hard lessons. She had been a venture capitalist for decades, but had stepped back after her husband's death. She now volunteered at the incubator, mostly to mentor women who reminded her of herself when she was young. Clara noticed her one evening, sitting quietly at the back of the room while another founder pitched a drone delivery service. After the session, Clara gathered her courage and approached. Ms. Cross, my name is Clara Bennett. Could I show you something? Evelyn studied her for a long moment before nodding. 5 minutes, sit. Clara opened her laptop, her hands trembling. She showed Evelyn her crude prototype addresses entered, routes generated, estimated times displayed. It wasn't polished, but it worked. When Clara finished, Evelyn leaned back, folding her hands. Who built this for you? I did, Clara said quickly. I taught myself. Nights, weekends, whenever I could. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. While raising 2 children, I assume you've got exhaustion written all over your face. Clara hesitated, then nodded. Twin girls. They're why I can't stop. I need to build something better for them, and for people who work as hard as I do. Silence stretched. Clara braced for another dismissal, but instead, Evelyn chuckled softly. Most of the founders I see are arrogant 20-somethings who think they've reinvented the wheel. You, my dear, have fire, and fire matters more than polish. Clara blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. I'll be blunt. Evelyn continued. Your prototype is rough. Your pitch needs work. But the problem you're addressing is real, and you have grit. I'd like to invest. Clara's breath caught. Invest. Yes, not much by Silicon Valley standards, but enough to give you room to breathe. $25,000. Seed money. Clara's knees nearly gave way. 25? Her voice cracked. You're serious. Completely. On one condition. Evelyn's gaze sharpened. You promise me you won't let the rejection stop you. You promise to keep pushing, no matter how many doors close. Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. I promise. The next morning, a check sat in her hands, crisp and impossibly real. Clara stared at it as if it might vanish. For the first time in years, she felt air rush into her lungs without the weight of fear pressing down. She walked back to her apartment in Queens, clutching the envelope against her chest. Inside, the twins toddled toward her, giggling, their little arms outstretched. Clara knelt, gathering them into her embrace. We're going to build something, she whispered into their hair, something no one can take from us. The spark had grown into a flame, and with Evelyn Cross by her side, Clara Bennett was no longer just surviving. She was stepping onto the path of transformation. The $25,000 from Evelyn Cross changed everything and nothing at the same time. It gave Clara Bennett the breathing room to think beyond survival, but it also introduced a new kind of chaos. Her cramped apartment became the headquarters of Novalink Systems. The kitchen table doubled as a desk, and the floor was littered with toys alongside stacks of papers. Lillian and Charlotte, now 3 years old, toddled between cables and whiteboards as Clara juggled conference calls with bottles of juice. She placed an online ad for a part-time software engineer and interviewed candidates on her couch while her daughters colored at their feet. Most applicants raised their eyebrows at the unusual setting, but one didn't flinch. Ethan Miller, a soft-spoken programmer recently laid off from a logistics company. He shook Clara's hand firmly and said, If you're building what I think you're building, I want in. That night, Clara and Ethan worked side by side until midnight, her daughters asleep in the next room. They scribbled algorithms on sticky notes, tested code, and laughed at the absurdity of debugging while balanced on mismatched kitchen chairs. But balancing motherhood and entrepreneurship was relentless. Some mornings, Clara woke at 5 a.m. to finish investor emails before the twins stirred. She fed them cereal, braided their hair, and rushed them to preschool, then spent the day hunched over her laptop, rewriting code until her eyes blurred. Evenings were split between playtime, baths, and late-night calls with Ethan. She often felt like she was failing at both roles. The startup demanded everything, but so did her children. The guilt gnawed at her most during the missed milestones. One afternoon, Miss Caldwell came across the hall, her face glowing. Charlotte sang her ABCs today, clear as a bell. You should have seen it. Clara smiled and clapped, but when the door closed, she collapsed against the counter, tears spilling silently. She had been in a video meeting, pleading with a skeptical investor, while her daughter's first song went unheard. Another time, Ethan texted her at work. Lillian just drew a full picture of the two of you. Stick figures, but it's something. Clara opened the attachment and stared at the crooked drawing of a mother and child holding hands. Her chest ached with both pride and grief. She wasn't there to see it happen. The work itself was brutal. Every day brought new obstacles. Their prototype crashed repeatedly. A beta tester complained that the roots were nonsense. Funding ran out faster than Clara could stretch Evelyn's check. Some nights she stared at her dwindling bank account, tempted to call Richard Hale, if only to scream at him for leaving her in this position. But she always closed her phone. He would never get the satisfaction of her reaching out. Self-doubt crept in at every corner. "You're out of your depth," she whispered to herself while staring at broken code. "You're a waitress playing at being a CEO." But then she'd hear her daughters giggling in the other room, their voices a reminder of why she couldn't quit. Breakthroughs came slowly, but when they did, they felt like miracles. One late night, Ethan burst into laughter as their program finally routed a batch of addresses without crashing. "It actually works," he said, spinning his chair toward Clara. "You did it." Clara shook her head, grinning despite herself. "We did it." She printed the test results and taped them to the fridge, right next to the twins' drawings. It was proof tangible, undeniable that Novalink was real. Still, the emotional toll was heavy. Clara often found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling while exhaustion pinned her body. She questioned everything. Was she sacrificing her daughters' childhoods for a dream that might collapse? Would they resent her one day for not being present enough? One evening, after a particularly brutal day of rejections, she found Charlotte curled up on the couch, clutching a stuffed bear. "Mama, why are you always on the computer?" the little girl asked. Clara's throat tightened. She sat beside her daughter, pulling her close. "Because I'm building something for you and Lillian, something that will make life better for all of us." Charlotte thought about this, then nodded sleepily. "Okay, but can you still read us a story tonight?" Clara kissed her forehead, tears slipping free. "Always?" Despite the struggles, Novalink grew in small but meaningful ways. A local courier company agreed to test their software, and the results showed a 15% reduction in delivery times. Ethan nearly danced in the kitchen when he saw the data. Clara sent the report to Evelyn, who replied with a simple message, "This is the start. Don't stop now." The words fueled her through another round of sleepless nights. By the time Clara turned 31, the apartment bore the marks of both family and ambition. The fridge was plastered with drawings and prototype charts. The dining table was permanently buried under laptops. Toys mingled with power cords. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. Clara often thought of Richard Hale in his glass tower, surrounded by assistants and polished surfaces. She wondered if he ever thought of her or the daughters he had dismissed before they were even born. And then she'd return to her laptop. coding late into the night with her children breathing softly in the next room. Because no matter how hard it was, she knew the truth. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building a future. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday morning when Clara's phone buzzed with an email from Harbor Line Couriers, a mid-sized delivery service in Queens. We'd like to proceed with a pilot contract for Novalink software. Let's discuss terms. Clara stared at the screen, hardly daring to breathe. After years of rejection, someone was finally willing to bet on her. She called Ethan immediately. They said yes, she whispered, her voice trembling. On the other end, Ethan whooped so loudly the twins burst into giggles. Clara, this is it. This is the start. The contract wasn't massive, just 6 months, a fraction of Harbor Line's roots, but for Clara, it meant everything. She printed the agreement and pinned it to the wall above her desk. Proof that Novalink wasn't just an idea. It was real. The pilot rolled out with bumps and frustrations, drivers resistant to change, software glitches that sent trucks in circles, but within weeks, the numbers spoke for themselves. Delivery times dropped, fuel costs shrank, even skeptical drivers admitted it made their lives easier. Word spread quickly. A local journalist contacted Clara, intrigued by the story of a single mother in Queens running a logistics startup from her apartment. Reluctant, but urged on by Evelyn, she agreed to the interview. The article ran a week later, From Waitress to Innovator, How a Single Mom is Redefining Logistics. The piece featured a photo of Clara sitting at her kitchen table, Lillian and Charlotte perched on either side of her, crayons scattered across papers covered in the code. The story described her journey from exhaustion to entrepreneurship, highlighting her resilience and determination. Clara braced herself for ridicule. Instead, messages poured in from strangers. You inspire me. I thought my life was over when I became a single parent, but you've given me hope. I wish I had your courage. For the first time, Clara felt seen not as a mistake or an inconvenience, but as a force. But success didn't erase the struggles of daily life. By the time Lillian and Charlotte started kindergarten, Novalink was demanding more of Clara's time than ever. Investors were circling now, eager to meet the single mom innovator making headlines. Clara attended pitch sessions in borrowed suits, her hair hastily pinned back, her phone buzzing constantly with updates from Ethan. The twins, in their tiny uniforms and oversized backpacks, waved proudly on their first day of school. Clara snapped pictures, smiling through tears. But beneath her pride was guilt. She was missing more moments than ever. Field trips, class performances, bedtime stories rushed or skipped because she had a late meeting. She promised herself it was temporary, that every sacrifice now was for their future. Still, the ache lingered. It was during one of those rushed evenings, while Clara reheated leftover pasta, that Charlotte looked up from the kitchen table and asked, "Mama, do we have a daddy?" The fork slipped from Clara's hand, clattering against the plate. Lillian looked up too, her big blue eyes wide with curiosity. "We learned about families at school," Charlotte continued matter-of-factly. "Some kids have a mommy and a daddy, some have 2 mommies, some have 2 daddies. We just have you. But who's our daddy?" Clara's heart twisted. She had always known this question would come, but hearing it aloud felt like being pierced with a blade. She sat down beside them, forcing her voice to remain steady. "You do have a father. His name is Richard, but he wasn't ready to be part of our family." "Why not?" Lillian asked softly. Clara stroked her daughter's hair, searching for words. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes. Sometimes they're scared or selfish. But what matters is this: he may not have been ready. But I was, and I chose you both. Every single day." The girls exchanged glances, not fully understanding, but sensing the weight of her words. Charlotte tilted her head. "Will we ever meet him?" Clara swallowed hard. "Maybe one day, but for now, you have me. And that's enough." The girls nodded, satisfied for the moment, and went back to their pasta. But Clara sat frozen, her mind spinning. She had built her entire life around protecting her daughters from Richard Hale's rejection, yet now they were old enough to begin seeking answers on their own. That night, after tucking the twins into bed, Clara sat at her desk with her notebook. She wrote in a shaky hand. They asked about him today, about Richard. I told them the truth, or part of it, but how long can I shield them? One day they'll want to know more, and I don't know how to tell them about the night he chose money over them, over us. She closed her eyes, exhaustion washing over her, but alongside the guilt was a surge of determination. If Richard Hale ever did re-enter their lives, it wouldn't be as the man who discarded them. It would be on her terms, when she had the power to protect her daughters fully. Weeks later, Clara stood in front of a room full of investors in Midtown Manhattan, presenting Novalink's progress. Her slides showed graphs of reduced costs and increased efficiency. Her voice carried steady confidence, honed from years of rejection. One investor leaned forward, impressed. Your growth is remarkable. What's next? Clara paused, thinking of her daughter's question at the dinner table, their searching eyes. Then she straightened her shoulders. What's next, she said firmly, is building something so powerful, so undeniable, that no one will ever again tell me or my daughters that we don't belong. The room erupted in applause, but Clara knew the battle was only beginning. 5 years can pass in a blur, yet leave behind a lifetime's worth of change. For Clara Bennett, those years transformed her from a struggling single mother in Queens to the CEO of one of the fastest-growing technology firms in the world. Novalink Systems was no longer a project patched together at a kitchen table. It was a billion-dollar company headquartered in a sleek Manhattan tower, its logo glowing across the skyline. Investors hailed it as the future of logistics, the company that would redefine how goods moved across America and beyond. Every major business publication carried Clara's name. She was no longer the single mom with a dream. She was the woman who had turned that dream into an empire. Her face appeared on magazine covers. Her speeches streamed online to millions. But the public didn't know everything. Behind the polished image, Clara was running a quiet, calculated operation that only a handful of trusted advisors knew about. Operation Iron Phoenix. Through a complex web of shell companies and proxy investors, Clara had spent the past 3 years acquiring shares of Hale Logistics, the very company Richard Hale had inherited from his father. Piece by piece, percentage by percentage, she now controlled 49% of it. And Richard had no idea. Clara sat in her corner office, the Manhattan skyline stretching wide beyond the glass, reviewing the latest reports. Her chief financial officer slid a file across the desk. We're 1% away from majority control. If we time the last purchase correctly, the board won't see it coming. You'll own them outright. Clara traced her fingers over the numbers, her expression calm, but her chest carried the thrum of years of buried emotion. Richard Hale, the man who once offered her $50,000 to erase her daughters. The man who had watched her leave his office, pregnant and humiliated, without lifting a hand to stop it. Now, she was about to become the majority owner of his family's legacy. Not yet, Clara said softly. Closing the file. Timing matters. I want it finalized the morning of my keynote in Chicago. Her CFO hesitated, then nodded. As you wish. Chicago. The city Clara had left in disgrace nearly a decade ago, boarding a bus with newborn twins and nothing but determination in her veins. Now, she was returning as the headliner of the Chicago Tech Conference, the most prestigious gathering in the industry. Novalink would unveil its next wave of innovations, hardware devices that seamlessly integrated with its software. Investors were calling it the dawn of a new era. Clara's assistants had already confirmed her presence. The press was buzzing with anticipation. But what few knew was that Richard Hale himself would also be on stage, scheduled for a panel on the future of supply chains. It was inevitable. Their worlds, which had spun apart, were about to collide again. At home that evening, Clara found her daughters, now 8 years old, sprawled across the living room floor, building a city out of magnetic tiles. Look, Mama, Charlotte said, holding up a tower of bright red and blue blocks. "This one has a bridge, and this one has an airport," Lillian added proudly. Clara knelt beside them, smoothing their hair. Their laughter filled the penthouse, the sound more precious than any applause she had received from investors. Yet, as she watched them, a flicker of unease stirred in her chest. Chicago wasn't just about business. It was about reckoning. The twins were older now, curious, perceptive. They had asked about their father before, and she had given careful, partial truths. But soon, the whole story might stand before them in flesh and blood. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Clara opened the secure drive on her laptop. Inside was a digital archive of her past, the positive pregnancy test, the hospital bills, the ignored emails, and most damning of all, the security footage of her being escorted out of Hale Logistics, clutching her box of belongings while visibly pregnant. Richard watching from above, his face unreadable, evidence, insurance, ammunition. Clara closed the laptop with steady hands. She didn't know yet whether she would use it, but she kept it close. Chicago would decide. The following week, Clara convened her executive team to finalize their conference strategy. The room buzzed with energy engineers fine-tuning demos, marketing leads, outlining media coverage, security staff detailing travel logistics. Her head of communications glanced at her nervously. "Are you prepared to step fully into the spotlight? The mystery CEO angle has worked for us, but after Chicago, you won't be able to avoid it anymore." Clara's lips curved into a small, deliberate smile. "I've been ready for years. Chicago is where we stop hiding." As the meeting dispersed, Evelyn Cross lingered behind. At 71, her presence was still commanding, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "You're walking into a lion's den," Evelyn said quietly. "Are you sure you want to face him there?" Clara's gaze was steady. "I don't just want to face him. I need to. This isn't only about me anymore. It's about showing my daughters that you never let someone else define your worth." Evelyn studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then make sure you win twice, once in the boardroom, and once in your heart." The day of departure arrived. Clara and the twins boarded Novalink's private jet, its white fuselage gleaming with the company logo. As they buckled into the plush leather seats, Charlotte leaned close to the window, her breath fogging the glass. "Is that Chicago, Mama?" she asked as the skyline appeared in the distance. Clara smoothed her daughter's hair, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Yes. It's where you were born." "Does our daddy live there?" Lillian asked softly. Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, he does." The girls exchanged a look, wide-eyed and curious. Clara wrapped her arms around them both. "Whatever happens, remember this: we belong here. All of us." As the jet descended, Clara's heart beat steady. She had left Chicago broken. Now she was returning as the woman who would rise from its ashes and claim everything that had once been denied her. The hum of the engines was soft, steady, almost like a lullaby. Clara leaned back into the leather seat of the private jet, staring at the world through a window framed by clouds. 5 years ago, she had left New York with nothing but 2 newborns strapped to her chest, a half-empty wallet, and a heart hollowed out by rejection. Now she was returning to Chicago as the founder and CEO of Novalink Systems, a company worth more than she could have dreamed in those sleepless nights. The contrast made her throat tighten. Across from her, Lillian and Charlotte fidgeted in their seats, their matching navy dresses slightly rumpled, their hair braided into identical plaits. They were 5 years old now, old enough to sense when something important was happening, young enough to approach it with boundless excitement. "Look," Mama Charlotte pressed her face to the window. "The clouds look like cotton candy." Lillian wrinkled her nose. "Cotton candy is pink. Char. Those are just white." Clara smiled faintly, the exchange tugging her back from her heavy thoughts. She reached over, smoothing a flyaway strand of Charlotte's hair. "Maybe we'll find pink clouds on the way home," she said gently. The jet was a world apart from the Greyhound bus that had carried her away from this same city 5 years earlier. She could still remember the sticky vinyl seats, the smell of diesel, the way she'd clutched both girls in a single carrier while her arms ached from holding them. She had been terrified, then terrified of the future, of failure, of the weight of motherhood pressing down on her unprepared shoulders. Now, the jet bore the Novalink logo on its gleaming fuselage, its crew addressing her as Ms. Bennett. A security team waited for her on the ground, and yet, even wrapped in luxury, she felt a different kind of pressure pressing on her chest. Triumph and dread were not opposites. They lived side by side in her heart. Charlotte's voice broke the silence. "Mama, is this where Daddy lives?" The question landed like a stone. Clara's hand froze on her glass of water. She turned slowly, finding both girls staring at her with wide, expectant eyes. Lillian's voice was quieter but more piercing. "Will we meet him for a moment?" Clara couldn't speak. The engines droned, filling the silence with their steady hum. Her daughter's eyes, his eyes watched her, so innocent, so trusting. Her mind raced. How could she explain to two 5-year-olds that their father had chosen absence, that he had offered her money to erase them? How could she tell them that the man they longed to meet had once seen them as a problem instead of a blessing? She forced her lips into a small smile. "Maybe," she said softly, "Chicago is where he lives." "Will he know us?" Charlotte pressed. Clara's chest ached. She thought of Richard's face when he had last seen her, when he had chosen silence over responsibility. Would he even recognize his daughters now, two bright, curious girls whose laughter filled every corner of her world? "He will know who you are," Clara answered carefully. It was the truth, though not the whole of it. The twins seemed satisfied, turning back to their coloring books, but Clara's hands trembled as she folded them in her lap. Later, after the girls drifted into a nap, Clara gazed out the window at the expanse of sky. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, polished, poised, a woman unrecognizable from the frightened secretary she had once been. And yet, the same scars remained. Chicago wasn't just another city on her schedule. It was the battlefield of her past, the place where she had been broken and humiliated. Now she was returning not just with power, but with living proof of her survival, the two children Richard had dismissed before their first breath. She whispered to herself, almost as if confessing to the clouds, "This isn't about revenge, it's about truth." But deep inside, she knew revenge was part of it too. When the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, "We'll be descending into Chicago shortly," Clara straightened, brushing a hand over her daughter's hair to wake them. Lillian blinked sleepily. "Are we there? Almost," Clara said, forcing a calm she didn't feel. Charlotte sat up quickly, her small hand tugging at Clara's sleeve. "Will Daddy be waiting for us at the airport?" Clara's breath caught. She looked into her daughter's eyes so bright, so eager, and all she could manage was silence. The truth pressed heavy against her chest, but she held it back, unwilling to shatter their innocence just yet. Instead, she pulled them both close, kissing the crowns of their heads. "No matter what happens in this city," she whispered, "we're together. That's what matters most." The girls nodded, leaning against her, their trust absolute. Clara closed her eyes, holding them as the jet tilted toward the city skyline. The glass towers gleamed in the distance, each one a reminder of the life she had once been denied. This time, she wasn't returning broken. This time, she was returning with power, and somewhere in that city, Richard Hale had no idea what was about to arrive on his doorstep. The Chicago Tech Conference glittered like a temple of ambition. The VIP reception was held in the glass observatory at the top of the city's newest skyscraper, its walls offering a 360-degree view of the skyline Clara once fled. The room pulsed with soft jazz, clinking glasses, and the low hum of industry titans brokering deals over champagne. When Clara entered, heads turned. For years, she had kept herself out of the spotlight, letting Novalink's brand speak louder than her face. But tonight, There was no veil of anonymity. The press had already spread word that the enigmatic founder would appear. Her tailored crimson suit caught the light, bold and unapologetic, the exact opposite of the timid secretary she once was. Conversations paused, murmurs rose. That's her, Clara Bennett, the single mother who built Novalink from nothing. She carried herself with calm precision, shaking hands, offering polite smiles, but never lingering long enough to appear desperate. Every step echoed with quiet defiance, every glance a reminder that she belonged in this room. 45 minutes later, the crowd shifted. A ripple passed through the room as Richard Hale entered. He was still handsome, but time had not been kind. His once polished confidence now looked like armor worn too thin. Fine lines etched his forehead. His smile was a fraction too tight, his handshake a little too forced. Rumors about Hale Logistics' decline had been circulating for months, and the strain showed. Clara watched him from across the room before he saw her. For a fleeting second, she allowed herself the indulgence of observing the man who had once dismissed her, who had left her to carry the weight of 2 lives alone. He wore his designer suit like a shield, but she noticed the slight slump of his shoulders, the way his eyes darted as if measuring the room for threats. And then, inevitably, his gaze found hers. The recognition hit him like a jolt. His confident stride faltered, his glass nearly tipping in his hand. He froze, staring at her across the crowded floor as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Clara didn't flinch. She simply tilted her chin, holding his gaze, daring him to look away. The distance between them shrank as Richard made his way through the crowd, his movements stiff, deliberate. By the time he reached her, the surrounding conversations had quieted, people sensing the undercurrent but not knowing the history. Clara. His voice cracked slightly before he caught himself. He tried again, steadier. Clara Bennett. Her smile was polite, razor-edged. Mr. Hale. The formality cut sharper than any insult. Around them, executives leaned in subtly, their curiosity piqued. "I didn't expect to see you here," Richard said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And yet, here I am," Clara replied smoothly, lifting her glass of mineral water. "The world has a funny way of turning, doesn't it?" An older investor nearby chuckled, breaking the silence. "So, you two know each other?" Richard answered too quickly. "She worked at Hale Logistics years ago. Briefly, a secretary." Clara's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. "Executive secretary," she corrected evenly. "While finishing my master's in computer science, though I doubt Mr. Hale remembers those details." A faint hush fell over the group. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "it seems you've found your way." "Some might say that," Clara replied, her tone deceptively light. "Novalink was valued at $3.9 billion this morning. And Hale Logistics, I hear restructuring is never easy." The barb landed. His lips pressed into a thin line, but he forced another smile. Rumors tend to exaggerate. Clara tilted her head slightly, the motion controlled, deliberate. Perhaps they just reveal what some would rather keep hidden. For a moment, the air between them vibrated with unspoken history. Clara could feel the memory pressing at the edges of her composure the day he had offered her money to disappear. The humiliation of being escorted out while visibly pregnant. But she refused to let it show. She leaned closer, her words quiet but edged with steel. "You once told me I didn't belong in rooms like this, that I would never be one of your people." Richard stiffened. "Clara." "That was a lifetime ago," she interrupted smoothly. "Yes, and yet here we are. Same room. Very different balance of power. Around them." The conversations had resumed, but the curious glances lingered. Clara decided she had made her point. She set her empty glass on a passing tray and straightened. "I have other commitments tonight," she said, her tone final. "But I'll see you tomorrow, won't I? At the panel discussion?" Richard blinked, startled. "You're on the panel, I am," Clara replied, her smile faint and controlled. "We'll have plenty of time to compare notes." She stepped away, her heels clicking against the polished floor, leaving him standing amid murmuring executives, his composure cracking just enough for those closest to notice. Later that night, back in her hotel suite, Clara tucked her twins into bed. Charlotte murmured sleepily, "Mama, did we see Daddy today?" Clara froze, her breath catching. "No," she said softly, smoothing her daughter's hair. "Not yet." But in her heart, she knew the meeting was no longer a distant possibility. It was coming tomorrow, under the bright lights of the conference stage. And this time, it would not be Clara who froze. The main auditorium of the Chicago Tech Conference was packed wall to wall. Over 2,000 industry leaders, journalists, and investors filled the rows, the air charged with expectation. The chatter dimmed as the house lights dropped, replaced by the glow of a massive screen bearing the Novalink logo. When Clara Bennett walked on stage, the applause swelled into thunder. She paused at the podium, letting the sound wash over her. Just 5 years ago, she had stood on a cramped diner floor, balancing plates for customers who never learned her name. Now, the room hung on her silence. "Thank you," she began, her voice calm, steady. 5 years ago, I was a single mother in Queens, working double shifts to keep the lights on. I didn't look like what most people imagine when they thought of an innovator. And when I told people my idea, most laughed. They told me I was dreaming too big, that I didn't belong in rooms like this. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Clara lifted her chin. "But what they forgot," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "is that innovation doesn't come from comfort. It comes from hunger, from necessity, from people who have nothing left to lose and everything to prove." The applause was immediate, loud, but Clara pressed forward. She walked across the stage, her presentation unfolding behind her graphs, maps, routes shrinking in real time as Novalink's algorithms worked. "We've saved our clients over $3 billion in wasted fuel costs. We've cut delivery times by 20%. And today, I'm proud to announce our next step, Novalink hardware integration." A sleek prototype device appeared on the screen. Gasps and murmurs followed. "Small, durable, and designed for drivers on the move," Clara said, holding the device aloft. "This is not just software anymore. It's a complete system. Logistics without waste, commerce without delay. A future where efficiency isn't a luxury, but a standard." The applause this time was deafening. Cameras flashed. Journalists scribbled furiously. Clara allowed herself a small smile. She had worked for this moment not just to prove her vision, but to prove her existence mattered. As the clapping ebbed, Clara's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced down discreetly at the message glowing on the screen. 52% acquired. You now hold majority control of Hale Logistics. Cameron, her throat tightened. She blinked once, steadying herself. It was done. Richard Hale's company, his family's legacy was no longer his. It was hers. For a split second, she felt her knees weaken. She gripped the edge of the podium, drawing in a slow, deep breath. Memories flashed like lightning being escorted out of that office, heavy with pregnancy. The $50,000 check shoved across the desk. The long bus ride with her daughters bundled against her chest. And now, standing before thousands, she had quietly weaponized those scars into power. She swallowed the burn of tears, forcing composure. The room could not see her break. Not now. Her voice, when it returned, was softer but carried further. "This isn't just my victory," she said. "This is a victory for every person who has ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told they don't belong. For the single mother working night shifts. For the father balancing 2 jobs. For the young girl coding on a secondhand laptop after putting her siblings to bed. We belong here. We always did." The audience rose to their feet. Applause thundered, rolling through the hall like a storm. Reporters scrambled to capture every word. Cameras zoomed in on her face, steady and radiant under the stage lights. but only Clara knew that in this very moment. She wasn't just unveiling Novalink's future. She was quietly announcing the death of Hale Logistics as Richard knew it. Backstage, her team waited with beaming faces. Ethan grinned like a man seeing his child born, clapping her on the shoulder. That was history. Clara, you lit the place on fire. Evelyn Cross, elegant as ever, stepped forward, her eyes glistening. Well done, my dear. You held the world in your hands and made them believe. Clara exhaled, her composure cracking just slightly now that she was out of sight. Her hand trembled as she reached for a bottle of water, gripping it tightly to steady herself. 52%, she whispered, almost to herself. Evelyn heard, her expression softened. Yes, it's yours now. Clara closed her eyes briefly. A single tear slipped free before she brushed it away. Not weakness. Release. She thought of her daughters, waiting with Mrs. Caldwell in the hotel suite. No idea of the seismic shift that had just taken place. She thought of Richard, perhaps even now in a boardroom somewhere, unaware that the ground beneath him had already vanished. Clara had imagined this moment for years. She thought it would feel like revenge, sharp and hot. Instead, it felt like something deeper justice wrapped in the quiet dignity of survival. 5 years of pain, humiliation, exhaustion, all of it had crystallized into this single truth: she had won. That evening, as the conference buzzed with news of Novalink's expansion, Clara sat alone in her hotel suite for a rare moment of silence. The twins were asleep in the next room, their soft breathing carrying through the walls. She looked out over the Chicago skyline, the same skyline she had once stared at through tears, wondering if she would survive another day. Now she saw it differently, not as the city that had broken her, but as the city where she had risen again. Clara lifted her glass of water in a quiet toast to the night sky. To survival, she whispered, to belonging, to never being erased. The revolving doors of Hale Logistics headquarters spun slowly as Clara Bennett stepped through, her crimson heels clicking against the marble floor. On either side of her walked Lillian and Charlotte, their small hands tucked into hers. The girls, dressed in matching navy blazers and white blouses, moved with the unconscious synchronicity of twins. Every head in the lobby turned. Conversations halted. The receptionist's eyes widened, darting from Clara to the 2 girls trailing at her side. The resemblance was unmistakable, the tilt of their chins, the piercing blue eyes, the very same shade Richard Hale carried in his own. Ms. Bennett, the receptionist stammered, rising to her feet. The board is expecting you. Thank you, Clara said calmly, her voice smooth as glass. We'll head up now. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor was silent, except for Charlotte's whispered, Mama, is Daddy really here? Clara squeezed her daughter's hand gently. Yes, he's here. She kept her face composed, though her heart thundered in her chest. The boardroom doors opened with a heavy swing, revealing a long mahogany table surrounded by Hale's directors. Charts of declining revenue still glowed on the mounted screens. At the head of the table, Richard Hale was mid-sentence, gesturing toward a graph. His words faltered as his gaze caught Clara entering the room. The color drained from his face when he saw the twins step in behind her. What is this? Richard demanded, his voice sharp, strained. Clara didn't answer immediately. She guided the twins to a corner of the room, where Zoe, her assistant, set them up with tablets and headphones. The girls settled quietly, unaware of the storm about to unfold. This Mr. Hale, Clara said, turning back to him, is a business meeting, one you've avoided for 5 years. The directors shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Richard and the twins, their similarities undeniable. Murmurs rippled across the table. Children, one board member muttered. Are they? Clara set a leather folder on the table and opened it with deliberate precision. I'll save you the speculation. These are my daughters, Lillian Grace and Charlotte Rose. Their father is Richard Hale. DNA tests confirm what your eyes already know. Gasps erupted around the room. Several directors leaned forward to examine the documents. Clara slid across the polished surface birth certificates listing Richard's name, lab reports, copies of emails sent years ago. Richard's jaw tightened. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. Some stunt, some elaborate denial. Clara cut in, her tone icy calm. "You can deny my words, Richard, but not science, and not them." She nodded toward the corner, where the twins sat, their blue eyes focused on their screens. The board stared. The resemblance was too strong, too precise to be coincidence. "Enough of this," Richard barked, though his voice cracked. "We are here to discuss restructuring." Not Clara's lips curved into a faint smile. "Oh, but we are here to discuss restructuring. You see, Mr. Hale, I'm not merely the mother of your children, I am also the majority shareholder of Hale Logistics." Silence. Stunned. Total silence. She gestured, and her attorney distributed documents to each board member. "Through a network of holding companies, I've acquired 52% of Hale Logistics stock. As of yesterday, I control this company." One director, an older man with silver hair, scanned the papers, then looked up slowly. "She's telling the truth. The filings are all here, legally sound. She owns majority control." The room erupted into whispers. Richard's face paled further. "This is impossible," he stammered. How could this happen without me knowing?" Clara leaned forward, her voice low but cutting. "Because you underestimated me, Richard, just as you did 5 years ago when you offered me money to disappear. While you squandered your father's legacy, I built my own, and now I own both." The boardroom crackled with tension. Richard's fists clenched against the table. His carefully curated facade of confidence crumbled with every passing second. "This is a hostile takeover," he hissed. "No," Clara replied calmly. "This is justice." She straightened, addressing the board. "Gentlemen and ladies, I'm not here to debate. I'm here to inform you, effective immediately. Richard Hale is relieved of his duties as CEO. He may retain a non-executive board seat, but leadership transitions today." Gasps and murmurs surged again. Directors shuffled their papers, some nodding grimly, others casting cautious glances at Richard. An older director finally spoke. "She has the votes. Hale, sit down." Richard staggered back from the table, his composure slipping entirely. His eyes darted toward the twins, then back to Clara. "You planned this," he said hoarsely, "from the very beginning." Clara's gaze was steady. "Not from the beginning. In the beginning. I only wanted you to acknowledge your children, to stand beside me instead of turning your back. But when you chose power over love, money over responsibility, you gave me the reason to fight. And I did." Richard's knees seemed to buckle slightly. He braced himself against the table, his face drained of color. "They're really mine," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Clara's tone softened just slightly, but her eyes did not. They always were. "You just refused to see it." The boardroom fell silent again as Richard sank into his chair, shoulders hunched, his collapse on full display. The directors, sensing the end of an era, turned their focus to Clara. "Ms. Bennett," the chairman said slowly, "what are your intentions for Hale Logistics?" Clara's voice was clear, resolute. "Integration with Novalink, restructuring from the ground up, innovation where there has been stagnation, and a future where no one in this company is ever told they don't belong." The room erupted into measured applause, cautious but approving. Clara allowed herself a breath. She had won not just the company, but the narrative. From the corner, Charlotte's small voice suddenly piped up, carrying across the room. "Mama, that man looks like us." Every head turned. Richard froze, his face ashen. Clara bent down beside her daughters, smoothing their hair with a steady hand. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly, but loud enough for the board to hear. "That's your father." The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. The truth finally laid bare. The boardroom was heavy with silence after Clara's declaration. Papers rustled nervously. Richard Hale sat rigid, colorless, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The weight of recognition of daughters, of betrayal, of defeat hung thick in the air. Clara remained standing, her posture steady, her voice gathering strength. "You sit in this tower," she said, her gaze sweeping the board, "and speak of numbers, of profits, of legacies. But let me remind you what your leadership has meant outside these walls." She turned toward Richard, her eyes sharp. "Do you remember the eviction notices? Richard, because I do. The nights I came home to find another letter taped to my door, threatening to put me and your children on the street. The room was still. Clara's voice did not break, it sharpened. Do you remember the hospital nights? Because I do. Watching our daughters, born too early, lying in incubators, machines beeping, nurses rushing, bills piling, I sat alone by their bedsides, praying they would live while you slept comfortably in penthouses." Richard shifted, his face drawn and ashen. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came, and the unpaid bills. Clara continued, her voice quiet now, cutting deeper with its calm, "The ones I stacked in drawers until they spilled out like a flood. Rent, formula, electricity. I worked until my body broke, because you decided 3 lives were nothing but an inconvenience to erase with a check." One of the board members cleared his throat, but Clara pressed on, her voice trembling not from weakness but from fire. "I built Novalink in those shadows, with a second-hand laptop, typing code with one hand while rocking a crying baby with the other. I fought through rejection, ridicule, and exhaustion, because I refused to let your choice define the rest of my life or theirs." She gestured toward her daughters in the corner, their small figures oblivious, headphones covering their ears. "They are the reason I stand here today. Not you, not your name, them." The silence deepened. Richard's chest rose and fell rapidly. His shame was visible, raw. His board, once deferential, now looked at him with undisguised contempt. At last, the chairman spoke, his voice grave. "Mr. Hale, you have failed this company financially, strategically, morally, and Ms. Bennett has not only proven her stake, but her vision." The gavel of corporate judgment fell in slow motion. "I move," the chairman said firmly, "that Richard Hale be removed as CEO of Hale Logistics, effective immediately." Murmurs rippled around the table. A vote was taken swift, decisive. One by one, hands rose in favor, unanimous. The chairman declared, "Mr. Hale, you no longer serve as CEO. Ms. Bennett, as majority shareholder, you may proceed with leadership restructuring." Richard sagged back in his chair, eyes glazed, his empire slipping through his fingers like sand. For Clara, the moment should have tasted of triumph. Instead, it burned bittersweet. She had won, but the victory did not erase the scars of how she had been forced to fight. She gathered her papers calmly, her hands steady even as her heart raced. She had spoken her truth in the very room that once discarded her. The chains of humiliation, silence, and powerlessness had finally shattered. But just as she turned to leave, the innocence of her daughters pierced the air. Charlotte tugged off her headphones and looked around curiously. "Mama, is it done?" Clara smiled faintly. "Yes, sweetheart, it's done." Then Lillian, her wide blue eyes fixed on Richard, asked the question Clara had dreaded from the moment she stepped into this room. "Are you our daddy?" The words rang across the polished boardroom like a gunshot. Every executive froze, every gaze snapping to Richard. The twins stood now, walking closer, their little shoes tapping against the hardwood floor. They looked at Richard with unguarded curiosity, their heads tilted in the same way he often did when considering a problem. "Are you?" Charlotte repeated, her voice small but firm. Richard's lips parted. His eyes flickered from one twin to the other, their identical blue eyes, their caramel hair, the undeniable mirror of himself reflected twice over. His throat worked, but his voice cracked when it finally emerged. "Yes," he whispered hoarsely. "Yes. I'm your father." The twins exchanged a look, simple and innocent. Lillian reached for Charlotte's hand. "Then why didn't you want us?" The question sliced deeper than any accusation Clara had delivered. Richard swayed slightly, his composure collapsing completely. He pressed his palms against his face, his voice breaking. "I was wrong. I was afraid. But the words fell flat in the sterile boardroom, drowned in years of absence. Clara stepped forward, placing herself between her daughters and Richard. Her voice was gentle but unyielding. "That's enough. You don't owe them excuses, not today. What they needed, you refused to give, and now, what this company needs, I will provide." The board members rose, some leaving quietly, others lingering to offer brief, respectful nods to Clara. She had not only dethroned a CEO, she had rewritten the power dynamic of the entire company in one morning. Richard remained slumped in his chair, staring at the floor, broken in ways no balance sheet could measure. Clara guided her daughters toward the door. "Come on, girls, time to go." As they walked hand in hand, Charlotte glanced back once. Richard's eyes lifted, meeting hers for a fleeting second. It was not triumph he saw reflected there, but the unfiltered innocence of a child, asking why. And in that moment, Richard Hale felt the full weight of his shame, not as a businessman, but as a father who had failed before he had even tried. Clara walked out of the boardroom taller than she had ever felt, not because she had claimed victory over Richard Hale, but because she had broken the chains of silence, shame, and dismissal that had bound her since the day she was cast aside. Her daughters walked beside her, their small fingers entwined with hers, their presence her greatest vindication. The world outside buzzed with headlines and flashing cameras, but Clara's heart was fixed on a single truth. They were free. The story exploded across the financial world like wildfire. By the next morning, every major newspaper carried Clara Bennett's name on its front page. The Wall Street Journal's secretary turned billionaire buys ex-boss's empire. New York Times, from Fired and Pregnant to Fortune 500. Powerhouse, the rise of Clara Bennett. Bloomberg, Hale, logistics. Ousted, meet the woman who took it all. Television anchors dissected her every move. Online blogs churned out opinion pieces, some hailing her as a feminist icon, others branding her ruthless. Memes spread of her walking into Hale Logistics with her twins, red heels flashing, captioned, "This is what revenge looks like." Through it all, Clara remained composed. She granted carefully chosen interviews, her words measured, her posture calm. She spoke about innovation, efficiency, the future of logistics. She rarely mentioned Richard. She never once mentioned the humiliation she had endured. But late at night, when the cameras were off and the twins slept peacefully in the next room, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She felt the old ache in her chest, the tension between justice served and wounds still raw. Life became a tightrope. Mornings were filled with media briefings and meetings with Hale's nervous senior staff. Afternoons belonged to her daughters, helping with homework, braiding their hair, listening to their endless stories about kindergarten. Evenings meant strategy sessions with her legal and financial teams, mapping out the integration of Hale into Novalink. She moved through it all with grace, but exhaustion clung to her. Some days she found herself gazing at the twins and whispering, "Am I enough for you? Am I giving too much of myself to this fight?" They always answered her in the simplest ways. A hug around her waist, a drawing proudly taped to her office wall, the sound of their laughter cutting through the sterile boardroom corridors. One rainy afternoon, while reviewing quarterly reports, Clara's phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She almost ignored it. Something in her gut told her not to. She answered, "Clara." Richard's voice came quiet, stripped of arrogance. "We need to talk." Her stomach tightened. "About what?" "The girls," he said softly. I'd like to see them." Clara leaned back in her chair, her jaw tightening. Memories surged, the $50,000 check shoved across a desk, the nights she had cried alone in a Queens apartment, the NICU bills piling up while he dined in the five-star restaurants. "Now you want to see them?" she asked, her voice colder than she intended. "I know I don't deserve it," Richard admitted, "but they're my daughters. I can't change the past. But maybe I can start to make things right." The silence stretched. Clara stared at the city skyline outside her office window. That evening, after tucking Lillian and Charlotte into bed, Clara sat at her desk with her old leather notebook, the one she had once filled with fears, promises, and rage. She opened to a blank page and wrote slowly, "He wants to see them. Part of me wants to slam the door in his face, to let him live with the weight of absence, just as he left us with it. But another part of me wonders, what if they need him, even a little? What if denying them the chance to know him makes me the very thing I hate?" Her pen stilled. She pressed the notebook closed. The next morning, she summoned her attorney. "Draft visitation terms," Clara instructed, her voice even. "Strict ones, supervised, 2 hours per month, with a licensed social worker present, no exceptions." The attorney raised an eyebrow. "That's unusually limited." "Are you sure?" Clara nodded firmly. "Yes. If he wants to see them, he'll prove he's capable. They are not bargaining chips. They are not rewards. They are children, my children, and they will not be hurt again." Days later, Richard sat across from her in a private conference room, the signed papers between them. He looked thinner, worn, stripped of his former shine. "You'll allow me only 2 hours a month?" he asked quietly. "That's 2 hours more than you gave them in 5 years, Clara replied, her gaze unwavering. He flinched, then he nodded. "I'll take it. Whatever you allow." For the first time, she saw something in him she hadn't before. Not arrogance, not power, just shame. That night, after the twins fell asleep, Clara sat by the window of her new Chicago office. She could see the Hale Tower in the distance, its glowing sign already marked with Novalink's Phoenix emblem beside the Hale name, a symbol of what had been broken, now rebuilt. She sipped tea slowly, letting her thoughts wander. Vengeance had carried her this far. The need to prove, to fight, to survive. But compassion whispered at the edges of her mind. For her daughters, not for him. For their right to know where they came from, even if where they came from was fractured and flawed. Her reflection in the glass looked stronger than she remembered. Her face held lines of fatigue. Yes, but also resilience. She thought of her daughter's laughter in the hotel suite, their innocent questions in the boardroom, the way they carried both her determination and Richard's unmistakable features. She whispered softly to her own reflection, words meant for herself, alone. "You don't get to decide their worth anymore, Richard, and I don't get to decide whether they'll love you or not. That's theirs to choose. My job is to protect them, and to never let them feel unwanted." She exhaled, a long breath that felt like letting go. The media frenzy continued for weeks. Headlines, interviews, photo shoots. But beneath the noise, Clara knew the real battle wasn't in boardrooms or on magazine covers. It was in the quiet choices she made every day to balance power with tenderness, to lead without losing sight of motherhood, to hold vengeance in one hand and compassion in the other. The chains of the past had been broken, but the path forward was hers to walk one steady step at a time. The headquarters of Hale Logistics looked different now. 6 months after Clara Bennett assumed control, the building hummed with fresh energy. New signage gleamed across its glass facade, Novalink Hale Group. The Phoenix emblem rose beside the Hale name, not replacing it, but transforming it. Rebirth etched in steel and light. Inside, employees moved with renewed purpose. Old hierarchies had been dismantled. Departments once strangled by bureaucracy now pulsed with collaboration. And on the 12th floor, something truly unprecedented had been built, a full-service child care center. Clara visited often. That afternoon, She walked the hall lined with murals painted by local artists, scenes of trees growing from ashes, of children holding stars in their hands. She paused at the glass door, watching her daughters. Lillian and Charlotte sat cross-legged on the floor, helping younger children assemble blocks into tall towers. Their laughter rang out, pure and unburdened. A few employees passing by smiled warmly. "Ms. Bennett," one of them said, "I wish something like this had existed when I started here." "Thank you." Clara's eyes softened. Every parent deserves to work without choosing between livelihood and love. It was more than a policy. It was a promise that no one in her company would ever feel as she once had discarded, unseen, struggling in silence with babies in her arms. Weeks later, a new issue of Fortune hit stands nationwide. The cover was striking Clara, seated in a sleek executive chair, her crimson heels crossed elegantly, with Lillian and Charlotte leaning against her shoulders. The headline read, "Clara Bennett and Daughters Redefining Success." Inside, the article detailed her meteoric rise from secretary to founder, from poverty to power. But it wasn't just about billions and boardrooms. It was about resilience, the courage to stand alone when no one believed, and the conviction to build a system where others would not be left behind. Clara didn't read all of it. She didn't need to. She kept the magazine in her office, tucked between framed family photos, as a quiet reminder that the world finally saw what she had always known: her worth was not theirs to measure. One late evening, long after the building had emptied, Clara sat alone in her corner office. The city lights glittered across the skyline. Papers were stacked neatly on her desk, her daughter's drawings pinned proudly beside financial charts. But her gaze fell on a single frame hanging opposite her desk. Inside was a yellowed check for $50,000, the severance Richard Hale had once offered to erase her and her children from existence. Beneath it, engraved in a brass plate, were the words, "The price he thought we were worth," the reminder of what we built instead. Clara leaned back in her chair, studying it. Once, that check had represented despair, humiliation, a future she almost surrendered to. Now, it was her shield, not against Richard, not against his board, but against the temptation to ever doubt herself again. She had not destroyed it. She had not hidden it away. She had elevated it into a symbol proof that value was never determined by those who dismissed her. Her phone buzzed softly on the desk. A message from Mrs. Caldwell, now semi-retired but still part of her inner circle. "The girls did beautifully at piano today. They're growing fast." Clara smiled, replying with gratitude. She thought of the people who had stood by her: Mrs. Caldwell with her tireless care, Evelyn Cross with her faith and seed investment, Ethan Miller with his loyalty and code. Their names were not on magazine covers, but their fingerprints were everywhere in her success. She whispered a silent thank you to them all. At home, later that night, the twins crawled into bed beside her, clutching their stuffed animals. Lillian looked up sleepily. "Mama, when we're older, will we work in your big office too?" Clara kissed her forehead. "If you want to, but you don't have to. You can build your own dream. That's the real success." Charlotte yawned, her voice muffled against Clara's arm. "What if people tell us we don't belong?" Clara held them close. "Then you remember this. No one decides your value but you. Not a boss, not a man in a suit, not even me. You write your own story." Their breathing slowed, soft and even, as they drifted into sleep. Clara lay awake for a while, gazing at the ceiling. She thought of the girl she had been. The secretary humiliated and cast aside. She thought of the woman she had become, the CEO, the mother, the survivor who turned scars into power. And she thought of the future two bright girls who would never grow up doubting that they mattered. The next morning, Clara stood again before the glass wall of her office, the framed check catching the light behind her. She looked out over Chicago, the city that had once broken her and now bore her name. This was not revenge. It was legacy. The phoenix did not rise to destroy. It rose to remind the world that ashes were not the end. Clara Bennett had written her own value into existence, and she had done it not only for herself, but for the daughters whose laughter filled the halls of her company, and for every unseen worker who would never again be told they did not belong. The chains were broken, the legacy was alive. Clara's story reminds us of something many of us learn later in life. Our true worth is never defined by someone else's opinion, paycheck, or rejection. For years, she was told she didn't belong, that her life and the lives of her children were nothing more than burdens to be erased. Yet, in the quiet of her struggle, she discovered a truth we can all carry with us. Value comes from within, and resilience grows strongest in the shadows. Many of us have faced seasons where doors were slammed shut, where people underestimated us or dismissed what we had to offer. In those moments, it's easy to believe their judgment. But Clara shows us that even when the world says no, we can create our own yes. She built a life not just for herself, but for her daughters, proving that legacy is not about wealth or power, it's about courage, integrity, and the willingness to rise when the world expects you to fall. Her journey challenges us to ask what untapped strength lies within our own scars, and how can we turn our hardest seasons into seeds of something greater. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today and walking alongside Clara's journey of struggle, strength, and triumph. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to life stories that remind us of the resilience we all carry within. Until next time, stay strong, stay hopeful, and keep shining.